On the 15th of October, 2025, a nation with no coastline made a vow. If we have no mother, we shall create one. These were not just poetic words spoken by Ibrahim Traoré, the young president of Burkina Faso. They were a declaration, a rupture, a rewriting of the map. In a parliament once silenced by colonial echoes, he stood tall and declared the unthinkable, a 612-kilometer canal carved through the Sahel, a passageway of sovereignty from landlocked silence to maritime voice. For generations, Burkina Faso was a prisoner of geography, dependent on foreign ports, burdened by tariffs, delayed by red tape. But what if geography is no longer destiny? What if the desert could be split not by force, but by will? Stay with us, because this isn't just another story. It's the future our ancestors dreamed of. Subscribe and stand with us for an Africa that will never bow again. Because this is not just a canal. It's not just water. It's a mirror. And in that mirror, Africa sees not what was imposed, but what it chose to become. A declaration that shook the continent. It began with a sentence. Not a policy, not a budget, not even a promise, but a sentence whispered first in the halls of power, then roared through the streets of Ouagadougou. If we have no mother, we shall build one. Those words, spoken on the 15th of October 2025, were not meant for applause. They were meant to sever chains. Chains of geography, chains of dependence, chains that had bound Burkina Faso to the mercy of foreign ports for generations. President Ibrahim Traoré did not speak with spectacle. He spoke with stillness. In front of diplomats from across the globe, he laid out a dream that defied satellite maps and foreign policy memos, the construction of an artificial canal, 612 kilometers long, to carve a path from the arid north of his country to the rivers of the south. A lifeline, a corridor, a vein of sovereignty pulsing through the Sahel. And the world stood still. Burkina Faso, a country often overlooked, often underestimated, was about to redraw its borders not by war, but by will. Before that declaration, more than 80% of Burkinabe trade relied on the ports of Ghana and Togo. Goods sat in queues for weeks. Exporters paid premiums in bribes and fuel. National development plans were held hostage by foreign infrastructure. But Traoré saw it differently. To him, geography was not a curse, but a canvas, and he would not wait for the sea to come to his people. He would bring his people to the sea. Within hours of his announcement, global media lit up. Some called it madness, a Soviet-style mirage in the desert. Others saw a challenge to the geopolitical order. But across West Africa, something shifted. In marketplaces from Bobo Dioulasso to Niamey, people whispered of a dream once unthinkable, now spoken aloud. This was not a pipe dream. This was a pipeline. Traoré wasn't offering a fantasy. He was offering blueprints, engineering drafts, investment plans. He unveiled the Grand Canal du Phao, not as an aspiration, but as a blueprint to be followed and funded. $12 billion in projected cost. A decade of labor. International partnerships already lined up, Russia, China, Iran, and the African Union all voicing support. But what startled most was not the scale. It was the certainty. In a time when African leaders too often speak in the language of caution, Traoré spoke in the dialect of direction. Ce canal n'est pas un dette. C'est un semence, he said. This canal is not a debt. It is a seed. The canal became more than a project. It became a proposition that an African nation could design its own destiny, fund its own infrastructure, and command its own narrative. And perhaps that's what truly unsettled the old powers. Not the money, not the machines, but the message. From Paris came warnings of unrealistic ambition. From Washington, subtle threats of regional instability. But Traoré was not speaking to them. He was speaking to his people. He did not ask for applause. He asked for shovels. This is the beginning of Traoré Burkina Faso, not as a search term, but as a movement, a redefinition of what it means to be landlocked and unchained. And now the world must decide, will it watch this canal from a distance or walk beside it? When sand is no longer a barrier, the Sahel is not just a desert. It is a memory of droughts, of fleeing feet, of children carrying empty buckets toward dry riverbeds. For generations, the sand spoke louder than any speech. It swallowed dreams, swallowed crops, swallowed futures. But now, in a land where nothing flowed, water begins to whisper. At first, it was the sound of excavators slicing through the crust of forgotten soil. In Kaya, a northern region where dust is more familiar than dew, a man named Abdul stood silently beside his grandson and watched the machines dig. He was not a politician, not a planner. He was a farmer, the third generation to fight for green in a sea of brown. If the water reaches here, he said, our children won't need to leave. That was not a slogan. It was a lifeline. The Grand Canal du Phao promised more than passage. It promised presence, a physical manifestation of the state's commitment to those often left behind. $12 billion allocated not to theory, but to trench and turbine. A corridor of liquid defiance running 612 kilometers across a continent's spine, and with each meter dug, a new rhythm began. Villagers didn't wait for handouts. They organized. Along the projected path, communities formed cooperatives to maintain future riverbanks. Young people enrolled in navigation training, preparing for a future where the canal would not just pass them by, but employ them. At the heart of this transformation was ownership. Children in dusty classrooms no longer drew faraway oceans on faded maps. They sketched the blue ribbon of the canal cutting through their own backyard. They named the locks, imagined the boats. In their minds, the Grand Canal was not a government project, it was a national river. One child called it the spine of Burkina Faso, another, the river that doesn't wait for rain, and that spirit of movement, of making, began to infect the air. Traders opened temporary stalls near the construction sites, selling water, tools, and maps. Retired engineers came out of silence to advise local builders. Port workers from Ghana crossed borders, not to collect tolls, but to offer insight. Even nature responded. The early excavation brought moisture back to long dry zones, and in some areas desert birds returned, as if they too had heard the news. But it wasn't just birds watching. Foreign analysts, still skeptical, tracked the progress. They pointed to delays, to budget fluctuations. They waited for collapse. But on the ground, something more enduring was rising: trust. And it wasn't just trust in the state. It was trust in the soil. Trust that the ground would yield more than just hardship. Every shovel of earth removed was a line erased from the map of dependency. Every drop of water promised was a breath held, and then slowly exhaled. What had once been a prison of sand was now becoming a passage of purpose. And this defiance dressed as infrastructure is what the world could not quantify. It was not just about logistics, not even economics. It was about dignity, because when the desert no longer dictates your future, your mind becomes free to imagine new directions. Soon, whispers spread across the villages. This isn't just water. This is return. Return to the land. Return to possibility. Return to self. The canal, still incomplete, had already become a river of hope. And as the sand receded beneath the weight of machines and meaning, a truth emerged. When a people move together, even the desert makes way. A journey resisted, a vision that inspired. From Paris to Washington, the headlines were swift and sharp. Hydrological delusion, a Soviet mirage in West Africa. Strategic dependence on China and Russia. They called it a dream too big for a country too small. But that dream refused to shrink. As engineers dug deeper into the crust of Burkina Faso, critics dug into old narratives of failure, of fragility, of fatalism. Yet each accusation fell like dust off Traoré's shoulders. He did not counter with anger. He countered with action. At night, while foreign analysts debated his sanity, Ibrahim Traoré walked the construction sites with torchlight in hand. He spoke to engineers. He shook the hands of soldiers guarding sensitive zones. He asked only one thing: where there is doubt, I want perseverance. The Burkinabe media reported these visits not as presidential spectacle, but as resistance. Not resistance to foreign enemies, but to internal doubt, because the greatest empire ever to rule Africa was not France. It was despair. Traoré understood that better than any general, and so he led a new kind of campaign, not of conquest but of construction. Each week, he hosted press briefings, not to inspire but to inform. He shared costs. He displayed satellite data. He invited diplomats to tour the trenches. He had no need for slogans. He had spreadsheets. The phrase echoed again. Suquez-vous appelez un pari, nous l'appelons un calcul. What you call a gamble, we call a calculation. And slowly, the tune began to change. Satellites showed a clear band of water cutting across the Sahel, visible from space. International headlines softened. Africa draws its own sea. Burkina Faso defies the map. Russian engineers applauded the adaptation. Chinese officials praised a Southern-led success. The African Union announced a regional cooperation fund around the canal, and foreign investors, once skeptical, returned cautiously but steadily. Burkinabe exporters began rerouting cargo, testing symbolic river convoys. Villagers, once spectators, became organizers. They mapped schedules, shared knowledge, protected the new lifeline with their own hands. A vision that began with blueprints had become blood and breath. This was not a rebellion. This was a rebuttal, not against the world, but for something larger, for future, for flow, for freedom. But not all opposition came from outside. Internally, delays accumulated. Dust blanketed machines. Logistics buckled under strain. And yet, no one left the site. Because now, it was not just about one man's ambition. It was about national momentum and national memory. Every child who watched the excavators was learning something deeper than engineering. They were learning that African news could be about initiative, not only incident. The media no longer needed to import narratives. They had one of their own. Every brick laid, every valve installed was a headline carved in soil. What was once called the backwater of West Africa was now the front page of continental hope. Yes, critics remained. Yes, risks loomed. But beneath the noise, a tide was turning. And when Ibrahim Traoré stood once more before his people, this time not with a speech, but with a simple phrase, the nation listened. This canal is not against someone. It is for something. And in that moment, Burkina Faso stopped defending its dream. It began inviting the world to witness it. When the dream meets reality, dreams, like canals, must be maintained. Not just built, sustained. As the first locks of the Grand Canal du Phao opened and water surged through the Sahel, something extraordinary happened. Not just in the soil, not just in the books of economists, but in the hearts of a people long forgotten by the flow of global trade. Farmers in the drought-scarred provinces of northern Burkina Faso saw the change first. The old reservoirs, once filled with cracked clay and disappointment, now held shimmering promise. Irrigation was no longer a luxury, it was a right. Harvests doubled. Income stabilized. Children returned from cities where they had once fled in search of survival. But water, like justice, never flows without consequence. With abundance came questions. Who gets how much? Who decides? What happens when water becomes more valuable than gold? New rivalries emerged, not among nations, but neighbors. Some villages accused others of hoarding. Small local councils wrestled with quota systems and ancient tribal lines redrawn by new infrastructure. The central government responded, not with force, but with institutions. An independent regulatory authority was established, tasked with managing the flow, both of water and wealth. It wasn't just governance. It was rehearsal for sovereignty. Meanwhile, businesses moved in. Exporters, once shackled by border delays, now routed cotton, gold, and grain through inland ports. Transport costs plummeted by 40%. Delivery times halved. What had once taken weeks could now move in days. Along the banks, new towns sprouted, logistics hubs, cooperatives, repair docks. From Dori to Bobo Dioulasso, local workshops replaced foreign warehouses. But prosperity, like water, attracts thirst. Speculators arrived. Rents rose. Corrupt contractors tried to seize advantage. And once again, the burden of vigilance fell not just on the state, but on the people. So, the people adapted. They demanded transparency. They formed watch groups. Radio stations broadcast weekly audits. Universities sent interns to track impact metrics. Across the country, a civic culture began to flourish, not around charity but around shared control. Neighboring nations took notice. Ghana and Togo, once gatekeepers of West Africa's sea access, now watched with equal parts awe and anxiety. Mali and Niger proposed integration, connecting their own river systems to the canal. Maps were being redrawn, not by colonizers but by collaborators. In Addis Ababa, the African Union whispered of a continental waterway strategy. In Western capitals, diplomats whispered of shifting allegiances toward BRICS+. The world watched as the project, once mocked as impossible, began birthing possibility across borders. This was no longer just a Burkinabe story. It was a continental shift, a reminder that the scramble for Africa had ended, but the struggle for African control had only just begun. Students from Ethiopia studied the canal's logistics model. Young engineers in Kenya proposed smaller replicas. Economists from Senegal published case studies. Even African news networks, so often driven by disaster, began speaking a new language. Invention, not imitation. Of course, reality did not yield easily. Unexpected rains triggered flash floods in some zones. Some displaced families still awaited fair compensation. Some fears persisted that foreign investors might one day weaponize their stake in this flow of freedom. But the current kept moving, engines kept turning, and beneath it all, a pulse, a belief that this dream, once carved from sand, could stand. And so, the Grand Canal du Phao became more than just a trench of water. It became an ecosystem of will, because when a people build something together, they defend it not from the top down, but from the roots up, digging deeper, planting back the faith. Every dream must survive the dawn. As the morning sun touched the waters of the Grand Canal du Phao, its shimmer revealed not just a feat of engineering, but a new cadence in Burkinabe life. No longer just dust, no longer just waiting, but movement, rhythm, direction. From Dori to Kaya, marketplaces bustled again. Fishermen, who never dreamt of casting nets in this desert, now guided boats along freshly dug banks. Women sold tomatoes where the earth once cracked. Children gave names to locks, to bridges, to bends in the canal, as if naming a new member of the family. In Wagada's community radio stations, elders replayed Traoré's speeches not as political broadcasts, but as folk tales of return. This canal belongs not to those who signed it, the president had said, but to those who sweat beside it. That sentence, once a line in a speech, became a national refrain. This canal was no longer a project. It was a mirror, and in it, Burkina Faso saw the face of its conviction, not its conditions. The real legacy wasn't the water or the steel. It was the idea that a landlocked country could unlock itself with direction, and that direction needed structure. Traoré laid out a 5-point roadmap. 1. Local ownership. River communities formed basin committees, managing maintenance, security, and youth training. Governance, no longer distant, now walked barefoot among them. 2. Sovereign funding. A national water fund was established, fed by port taxes and export revenues. For the first time, Burkina Faso wasn't waiting for donors. It was banking on itself. 3. Transparent data flow. Every vessel on the canal was tracked by satellite. The data was made public, not as a gimmick, but as a guarantee. Efficiency no longer hid behind bureaucracy. 4. Generational education. Universities revised their curriculums. Hydrology, ecological engineering, logistic science. A new breed of Sahelian technician was being raised, not abroad, but at home. 5. Annual audits, public and ecological. Each year, the public received a report. Hectares irrigated, species returned. Jobs created. Sovereignty measured not in slogans, but in statistics. This was governance by transparency. Not control. Not spectacle. But continuity. And through it all, the canal became a symbol of persistence. At dusk, its waters shimmered in red, green, and gold. The colors of a nation that once begged for rain, now flowing with its own tide. At the water's edge, Ibrahim Traoré stood. Not to speak, not to perform, but to watch. Children ran. Markets rang. Fishermen returned home. And prayers were whispered, not to the sky, but in gratitude to the earth. Because now, water was not just a resource. It was memory. Proof that what was dry could bloom. That what was buried could rise. The Grand Canal du Phao was no longer a channel of doubt. It was the artery of belief. And if you believe this is what Africa needed all along, say amen in the comments below. From trench to testament, Africa writes its waters. The greatness of a project is never measured at its launch, but in its longevity. The Grand Canal du Phao is no longer just a trench through Burkina Faso. It is now a testimony written in earth and water. A message carved for all to read. Africa will not wait to be saved. Africa will carve its own tide. Yes, the desert still stretches. Yes, the rains still falter. Yes, the critics still speak. But so does the canal. It speaks through every fisherman who casts a line, every child who learns logistics in school, every family that no longer walks for water. This is not a utopia. It is a commitment. One shovel at a time. One drop at a time. The conviction of a people becoming their own architects. Traoré's face will not always be at the helm, but his phrase now lives in the nation's veins. We didn't just dig into the ground, we dug into our destiny. And that destiny is not exclusive. It is a challenge, a call, a current. If a country with no coast could create its own sea, what's stopping the rest of us from finding our flow? If this story moved something in your chest, don't scroll past. Like, share, speak, subscribe, because they buried our stories long enough. Now we water them and they rise. Drop your voice in the comments. Africa rise. New Africa. We build, we bloom. Africa carves her way. Because this is not just about Burkina Faso. It's about the power of belief with a blueprint. A land once silenced by sand is now echoing with direction. The Grand Canal is not the end of the story. It is the current carrying us toward the next chapter. Now, tell us, will you ride that current or be left watching from the shore?